going to begin with Deputy Commissioner Steve Fontana and ask you about an ideal world. What long and short-term strategies would Victoria Police undertake to support police officers after a future catastrophic event like Black Saturday? And how does this ideal differ from what currently happens? And how is gender implicated? There we are.
Look, I'll just start off. We all suffer from human frailty, and as I've sat here today listening to the presentations and gone through, and I am a man, so I probably need to make some admissions here that I could actually relate to a number of issues that were raised during the foreman over my career in terms of sense of helplessness, about personalising failures for matters that you had no control over, guilt, withdrawal, fear and shame for displaying emotions. And, you know, so we all have different ways of coping with trauma in our life, and some move to that path of recovery, as Andrew said, in different ways, and some never recover from the emotional scars. Disasters are character building, but they also are character destroying. And I've seen it in my career play out a lot, not only in the workplace, but in the community with violence, family violence, self-harm, suicide, substance abuse, mental health issues, and also in the workplace. And what I found in my career is men do talk. And I know you've got just asked, but they do talk. You know, particularly in the workplace with our members when we're dealing with issues, and unfortunately it's often after the fact where I've had men often on occasions break down and cry, and women too, unfortunately, but you know, they do open up and they do get on with their life afterwards if you've got the appropriate level of support in there. I've also seen it play out in interviews with offenders and things like that. But as I said, unfortunately it's too often after the fact. We've got a lot of really good programs within Victoria Police, and we focus on members that might go off with illness. And they always say it might be mental health issues and things. They say they don't want contact, they try to withdraw. But in reality, they need to contact. And, you know, so it's important in terms of the programs that we put in place that we maintain that contact for the workplace. But I'll just talk about Victoria Police. We're a large organisation. We've got over 4,000 employees. And we've got a whole support network in place. We've got a welfare unit that provides support to members and families when they're down. We've got psychology unit that provides counselling, and that's not only internal counselling, but we can refer to external counselling if members have got that fear about confidentiality and privacy. We've also got a police association that provides that support. We've got a police chaplaincy that provide supports, and they're offering visiting workplaces, and we've got a peer support network that really ramps into place during times of tough times, and it's about looking out for your own members, and that's the key, and we rely heavily on that peer support network during emergencies and when things are getting tough. We do critical incident reviews, so for police shootings, any major incident that our members are involved in, we do a review to learn from our response, but part of those reviews also look at how we support the members that are involved. For members involved, for example, in a fatal pursuit or a fatal shooting, a lot of those members never return to work or often leave after a number of years. So we're getting better at the level of support we provide. But the one thing that I've noticed during those reviews is we often overwhelm members with support at the initial stages. But what we're not doing is providing that follow-up backup, and that's one of the key things that we need to do into the future. A couple of things come out of today, just thinking about the emergency services and, you know, how do we train and prepare our members for going to critical disasters like Black Saturday, when you know that they're going to be separated from their families and their families may be actually involved and in danger. So that's a thing that I'm not too sure that we actually do well in terms of training members that you might be separated from your families during a critical period, and it's how do you actually prepare. And one of the things is about preparing members, and that can be done through training and things like that. And the other things I looked at is about that gender training. We don't focus on gender training, so I think there's certainly aspects that we need to consider about the responses for men, because, you know, I've seen it play out in a lot of places where we do go into denial, we do withdraw, and there's a whole range of things that do play out. So we do need to tailor our approach. And one final point that came out was really about the recovery, and what I noticed in terms of the arrangements that we have in place where we, after Black Saturday, you get GrowCon come in and, you know, men in particular felt that loss of control. And for a scale like that, from an emergency point of view, we say safety is our primary concern. We don't want members of the community getting injured or hurt going back into dangerous areas, so we close it off. But we probably don't link in enough with local communities and tap into that expertise, local knowledge and leadership, and I think there's a lot more that we can do in that area.
And may I ask you the conversation we've heard from Bob? What will you take back to work?
Well, it's very interesting because I suppose, I think there are a lot of things we can challenge, and we are trying to challenge, particularly in relation to family violence, for example, and we've got a forum next month, and particularly with our Chief Commissioner, all our organisations, say we need to stand up to violence against women and inappropriate behaviour. There's a lot more that we can do to challenge, as men, inappropriate behaviour and really do something. It was quite interesting when they say that some men will know that their friends, their mates may be abusing their wives, their girlfriends and children, and they do nothing about it. And it's about stepping up to the mark and taking a stand. So there's a lot of things that you can do in relation to that.
Will we see Bob talking at Victoria Police?
Well, I don't know whether he's on the invite list, Bob. I'll have to have a look at that, but it was a very interesting presentation.
Yeah, it certainly was. Women's Health Goulburn North East nominated our next panel member for an award for his work in hot debriefing, which helped one community through very difficult times after Black Saturday. Mark Summers has been intrinsically involved in improving response to disaster through local government and more recently with the SES. Mark, in your opinion, what should happen to improve post-disaster support to volunteers and men in the community? And again, I want you focusing on how is gender implicated.
Okay. Testing, yep. I guess my observations post Black Saturday relate not just to men in the initial phases, but to everybody. And that is that the concerns that most people had, that I'll expand on a little bit, relate to validating what people did. And that's the major part of the criticism that most people faced. And men in particular were probably more susceptible to that criticism, particularly where they got up and left their community because they evacuated with their families. And if they were in a CFA brigade, then they came back and got questioned as to why. And so from that point of view, we need to be mindful of validating that what people do is the correct thing, irrespective of which action they take. The other thing we need to be mindful of is that we train our fire brigades to put out fires. And when we have a large situation like the Black Saturday events, that's not possible. One fire truck, 10 fire trucks isn't going to make much difference at any one point in time. So of course the community, as they're leaving, see the fire brigade sitting on their trucks because it's too dangerous for them to go in. They don't necessarily understand the context of that. And so we need to train our people and prepare them for the potential for what the community may actually think and say about what they're seeing as well. It's the old adage, we've mentioned it before today. Everyone expects a fire truck at their yard. We're not going to get it. But we need to prepare our firefighters to be able to explain that a little better, and maybe that's through community education. The other concern that I had as seeing and doing a lot of debriefing with my firefighters was, did they do the right thing? Even when they did stay or they did leave, it didn't matter. They still had those questions hanging over their heads both ways. And add to that the community frustrations. You know, people drive past the fire station, see the truck's not there. Why not? Why isn't it out fighting the fire? We don't know where it is. Then the family puts pressure on. Do they stay? Do they go? And the like. And then there's your own image of what you want to do. So as a firefighter, your family might want you to go, but then you've got your own personal belief and your own values that you have to apply to this as well. This is big. It's overwhelming. Are you going to stay at home? Are you going to look after and get on the fire truck and fight the fire? Or are you going to go to a community refuge and sit that out with a large number of the rest of the population? So we have to try and wrestle with that internal conflict over what is the right thing to do. And that's something that I'm not yet seeing in any of the training manuals, and if I get any kind of influence over this, I'd love to be able to put something into there the basic training programs that educate people. Sometimes we have to be aware that our feelings are going to be up front, and we need to deal with those. In my local community, the criticism was long and extensive. There was lots of local gossip about where the fire truck was, what it did, what it didn't do. There was public agendas running there. They wanted, you know, a pseudo fire brigade established itself for a short time. And then, of course, we had the Royal Commission thrown on top of it. And the Royal Commission in the Murrindindi fire didn't immediately come out and say the CFA wasn't to blame, but there was suspicion created over a CFA person. Therefore, all CFA were tarred with that for a while in that area because that was the Murrindindi fire that we were involved in. So I guess when it comes to how do we help people, we need to look at trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And I guess I can offer a couple of suggestions here. The first one that I found worked really well was recognising what people had done. And that was going all the way through recognising those that were on the fire truck and spent multiple weeks on the truck following that particular day. Also recognising those that decided to leave early and take their family with them. And also recognising those who decided to stay and defend their homes. And each person had the right to make that decision. And that was probably one of the biggest challenges I had when I was debriefing my brigade, is to getting everybody comfortable that their decision was correct. And it wasn't, as somebody mentioned before in our commentary, up for anyone else to comment about whether that was a right decision or not. The other thing about recognition was things like awards and medals. And the boss here sitting beside me and I have had a few conversations about this. But in my area, for example, all the other agencies got medals and awards, police, ambulance, SES, and the CFA hasn't yet. And that's still an ongoing issue when the community looks at the CFA in my town and says, well, how come everyone else has got them and you haven't? That sort of, it just adds that layer of complexity to it. But the one thing I will, on the other side of that, say, the one thing that my brigade has taken a great solace out of, the recognition of actually having the chief come out and thank them. Was it a couple of years ago you came and personally thanked each member of the brigade, and that went far, far greater than handing out any medals. Someone who's respected by the subordinates, and that was, as I said, probably the best thing that is happening in my area. The other next point I'd like to make is to encourage that we have some kind of education package that goes out, whether it's with our minimum skills training or whether it's with some other package, about how the community might react in these large events. After all, we teach firefighters to put out fires, but when the fire's too big, our firefighters generally step back and just provide advice and provide information about what's going on. But there's nothing in manuals to do that. There's also nothing about how the community might react if you're seen sitting there waiting for the fire to come to you. So it's almost no H&S issue, and it's something we raised in our workshop just before lunch, that this kind of preparation, this kind of forewarning people about what to expect that the community may come up with is part of the preparation, if you like, the prevention or the mitigation of the feelings that some people might feel. I can put a similar lens on when we assisted with the floods in 2011. I went and was part of a public meeting in Kingupna, a small little town, not isolated, large area, but they had issues with the water not draining away because the pipes were all blocked up. Bottom line was that there was nobody actually listening to what they were saying. And therefore, the people that got put in there to manage this meeting were very surprised that the community was angry. They were going in there thinking the community would be happy about the fact they're volunteers and they're helping and so on. And they walked into a very angry group of people because every time they flushed the toilet, the bubbles came out in their backyard. So in that sort of circumstance, we need to prepare our people a bit better. And volunteers have got a really short amount of time they can devote to CFA in some cases. Some people love it, some people do the bare minimum. We need to pre-educate them. And I guess when it comes back to being gender specific, this is probably where the training needs to come for the guys. Help them to understand those conflicting priorities, and even if it's just discussing it, whether it's just capturing a few case studies and circulating it around, but talking about what might happen in a community, what the community might expect. Also talking about fires and fire planning and making sure that your family is looked after. I was having a discussion last night with Christine over there, and she talked about the fire brigade that won't allow people to get on a fire truck this season unless they actually present to their captain a copy of their home fire plan, so that they can see that they're going to take care of their family before they jump on the truck. I think it's a fantastic idea. And of course you then also have to be aware of your own personal feelings. What are you going to do? Are you going to feel comfortable confronting a Black Saturday again? Are you going to feel comfortable confronting just a normal house fire or even just a car accident? So I think people just need to have a little bit of an insight into their own feelings, and that's something that we don't currently do. And I think that's something we could look into.
And Mark, what about complacency? We're 4 years out of Black Saturday. What part does complacency, as these events get further away, how do you keep the momentum of developing the ideal world and actually really and truly putting gender in there? What are the actions then?
To be honest, I don't think we're at complacency yet. I think we're still, because we've got the legal class action still happening, I still feel we've got all those pressures still on the firefighters in those areas. There's still a lot of concern about what's going to be the outcome of those class actions. And no matter how much you reassure people that it's not about a firefighter or it's not about an individual, there's still that anxiety out there, and that's still hanging over their heads at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. We believe that by improving support for men, women and children, they'll all benefit. In your ideal world, Mark Duckworth, what long and short-term strategies would you have for the Department of Prairie and Cabinet play in influencing provision of support to men in the community in the long aftermath of a future catastrophic event? And how does this ideal differ from what currently happens? And again, put in gender in that mix, please.
I think the important thing to reflect on is that after the event is not what we're focused on at this stage. What we are looking at, and in terms of the changing paradigm within Victoria, within Australia, which is sort of summarised by the sort of resilience concept, is altering the way in which government, emergency services organisations, businesses, communities and individuals all interact. And I think there's a very key sentence in the National Strategy of Disaster Resilience, which says that this is about long-term behavioural change that will happen over many years and many political cycles. When we are talking about these concepts, it's really about thinking about things in advance. It's about focusing on what makes a community a well-functioning community, what makes an organisation well-functioning. And the thing that I really just want to focus on for a moment goes back to the original idea behind resilience, which is linked very much to the individual. If you think that back in the 1970s, when it was used in social work, it's really about why do two children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, why does one overcome all sorts of obstacles and the other not? And many people did research into this and looked at the issues around social connectedness, about social support, about adaptability. All these factors which we looked at then are still very much relevant now, whether we're talking about individuals or communities, because sort of resilience is not some abstract idea. It's really about the networks that pre-exist. It's about the hidden wiring that holds a community together, and through that affirms individuals. And I suppose the way in which I'd link it back to the issue of gender is that it is focused not on the individual isolated seeking to be heroic. It's about the fact that the community is an organism that is made up of all these links, and that what we really want to focus on is trying to foster these links anyway, because that's a good thing, but so that they are there as best as possible when adversity strikes. And I think one of the things that is a challenge in this overall reform process that we're undergoing at the moment is that we have an approach to emergency management that is a sort of a top-down approach, which in response and in times of severe crisis is required to do certain, bring about certain operational means. But longer term, it needs to be switched around, and that itself is a challenge, and it relates to the issues that we were talking about before this panel session, which is that true resilient communities may not necessarily be ones that fit into the stereotype of command and control, and I think that can be a challenge to people to recognise that before an event there needs to be these networks created, that individuals need to contribute and connect with other people and think more broadly about themselves and their families and their communities. And the role which government plays in that is an enabler. We can't, government cannot make communities resilient any more than they can make them happy. It's not a question of passing the Resilience Act and then that's that. It is, as the Resilience Strategy really points out a number of times, about this long-term behavioural change, and many of the things we've been talking about today are part of that. It's more akin to changing attitudes to smoking or to people wearing seatbelts in cars or to speeding. It's that type of attitudinal change that we're talking about, and I think we really need to reflect in this space that those are the types of programs that we're thinking about, in addition to the other important reforms that are taking place around sort of improving structures.
Mark, I'd like to put the hot poultice on you. You don't get off yet. A theme from the men was their preference for a drop-in service, open at flexible times with specialist health and wellbeing providers, much like the Well Women's clinics that we used to have and are in recess now because of funding. Would government fund such temporary clinics in the aftermath of disaster?
Well, there are others who are here who were involved in the recovery process after, say, 2009. I'm aware that VIVA did organise some gender-specific community events. Some is funded by Red Cross, and so, I mean, on the face of it, that suggests that would occur again. So, I think it's a question. I think with all of these things, you can ask something in the abstract, but it all depends what a particular community wants and needs at a particular time, rather than some general program that may not necessarily be what is needed. And I think I often refer that there was one individual well known who was commenting after, in relation to some of the recovery after 2009, saying everything was going fine until the help arrived. And I think that it's important for us to make sure that what is offered is in fact what people want, rather than sort of rolled out regardless of in fact what's needed.
So if they wanted clinics that had flexible times and things, it would be possible.
I don't run recovery, so I can't say this is what's going to happen. But I can say, all I can say is that as logically what you say seems to make sense. But
Thank you. Daryl, it's your turn now. Daryl Taylor, after experiencing Black Saturday and its long aftermath, what would happen to improve post-disaster support for men and women and children, and how would that be implicated by gender?
I think I'd begin with the kind of robust questioning that was implicit in particularly our two keynote speakers. So I would be encouraging people to question the foundations of everything that's associated with recovery. Even the word recovery, I think, is incredibly problematic as a community member who's been through that experience. One definition that I give of recovery is that it is a dog whistle for all those prefigured services that agencies bring in, even if they haven't had previous trauma experience working with people in trauma. So it brings out counselling, and in particular it brings out welfare. And both of those as strategies to support communities need to be questioned, because they also have unintended consequences for the positioning of citizens. And so I'm also very keen for us to question the merits of professionalisation as well, because that has implications for citizens and communities if professionals own the space. So the role or the relationship that you can have with the professional service providers is as one of child to parent often. So I think we need to question authority and power in the way recovery is constituted, if we're going to call it that. Another definition I would give of recovery is it's a going back to something that was before. And, you know, I think most of my Kinglake colleagues would say that we've been transformed by our experience. We've changed, and we don't want to go back to where we were before. And if you live in a peri-urban community that's on the edge of a whole lot of different state and municipal boundaries, and you've got a history of no planning and ad hoc layout and a whole lot of other social problems that are associated with people taking sanctuary in areas under trees to escape service providers, then you've got to say, well, you know, maybe recovery isn't about going back to what we had before either. So I'm really interested in regenerative systems. I probably would take issue with the idea of resilience being something that's based in social work. Again, I think we need to question social work. You know, I think it's a socio-ecological concept that's got a cosmological element to it, and it's probably got a biological element to it too. But we need to understand the way people relate to their place and what they know about that place. And that sort of knowledge and experience needs to be able to be validated in some way in the aftermath of a disaster. I think also we need to challenge corporatism as well as governments and some of those kind of frameworks as well, because communities are profoundly disadvantaged by those frameworks. Just as we have a hierarchical relationship with a master's educated professional when we're having a one-on-one counselling encounter, we're also disempowered communities when we are working with corporations or governments. They've got more resources and more institutional clout that communities don't have. They're also organised hierarchically. So whether you're a non-government organisation or a community service organisation, emergency services organisation, a government department, a big business or a corporation, there's a nominal head, a CEO. But if you look at a community, there's no such structure. So that profoundly disempowers our ability to relate with and influence those institutions. In fact, we're at a profound disadvantage. There are things that we can do as a consequence, and one of the things that we do really well is self-organise. And so I'm really interested in how we develop more reflexive organisations, more reflexive institutions, etc., that come in and ask questions of themselves and ask legitimate questions of what's actually happening in the community. The community in Kinglake, because of the absence of the CFA, they were off the mountain doing other things, you know, really just launched into action, and they were the first responders, and they did absolutely amazing work. You know, too often when I talk to other members of disaster communities, the amazing work that communities self-organised and got rolling in the aftermath of disaster is overwhelmed by people in suits or people with epaulets on their shoulders, or, you know, people with a professional, you know, I think they often come in using that systems theory idea with a hammer, and so, you know, they'll only see nails, and it may be that we need to give them keys and a whole lot of other tools, maybe a looking glass, and particularly if they're going to become contributive professionals, how do they actually use like a rapid rural appraising or participatory action research, or a way of actually finding out what the community's already done and what they're already doing and where they're already going, where's the momentum, and what do they actually see as the needs, and how do we actually constitute communities so that they can be able to have that discussion, because at the moment they can't, they're overwhelmed. So, you know, I find recovery much more frightening than disaster, because these are the sort of things that unfold and unravel, and, you know, particularly really good work in the aftermath of a disaster by citizens gets rode roughshod over or completely ignored and unseen, which I think is the biggest tragedy, because if we want to have prepared communities, they've got to have agency. And one of the things that professionals and governments do, whether they realise it or not, is that they take away power. And when they take away power, they make, as a consequence, we all become more vulnerable. And, you know, the best protection for a really robust democracy is empowered citizens, and I would say also empowered communities. So the way that we constitute our communities is critically important, and gender does have a really important way to do that, because the way we've historically constituted our communities has been around these hierarchical structures. And, you know, the sort of study that Dempsey undertook, you know, that was very typical of Strathmerton, where I grew up in rural Victoria, you know, in the 1970s. It was very much like that. So, and, you know, Kinglake as a kind of an outlying kind of, it's not really cosmopolitan rural, but it's kind of on the edge of a city, but it's not rural, and it's got, you know, it had a lot of political issues, and, you know, it was quite patriarchal, and, you know, men's violence was a way of solving problems. And certainly, you know, when I look at the recovery, I feel compromised and conflicted at probably every level, because, you know, in my own sense of self, in my relationships with my daughter and my partner, in our neighbourhood where there was domestic violence, there were opportunities for me to intervene. In community groups where there was violence, you know, there were opportunities for me to intervene. And, you know, you have that kind of play between having to work with these people tomorrow and the context that you're in and what you do at any one time. And, you know, I think at different times I intervened and at different times I didn't. And it certainly kept me awake, not just at night, but, you know, reflecting on those kind of things for a couple of days. So, you know, the way we empower women, the way we validate women's ways of working and knowing and being and interacting, and the way we encourage men. You know, I'm a big fan, and I don't know if Bob's familiar with this particular piece of work, but it's called Invitations to Responsibility by Andrew Jenkins. And what he does is he actually uses a series of questions which is essentially about encouraging ethical behaviour and critically reflecting on their behaviour. So if we're able to have those kind of questioning processes where we're opening up individuals and communities and organisations to become more reflexive, I think that that would be an incredibly important role, and particularly with gender in mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and there'll be time after this to chat with you about it. Craig, in your ideal world, let's hear about it. What are the long and the short-term strategies would the Fire Services Commission play in influencing provision of support to firefighters after a future catastrophic event like Black Saturday? And how does the ideal differ from you now?
Thank you. It's interesting what Mark and Daryl have said, because I think if you actually listen and pull those things apart, you've actually got most of the issues that we faced. Daryl's expressed the community side, and I think Mark's done what is the traditional fire service. One of the things that we've been interested to be involved in these discussions is the discussion. The fact that we actually have the discussion, and whether it's Bob that's pushing quite a different set of principles about challenging who we are, what society looks like, or whether it's down to some very basic fundamentals of acknowledging what people actually aim to do. And really interesting, because if you bring it back to the distilled right at the bottom, in a fire service, emergency service, people actually want to contribute to achieve. And I reckon Mark hit it on the head before. When people go out to these big events and they can't achieve, that is challenging to them, and particularly challenging to a male. Very challenging to a male. And I reckon this is very complex. I think you'd all appreciate that. This is a complex, and we won't fix it in any one discussion, any one day. It's actually got multiple layers in it. And for us to be able to understand it and understand the dynamics of communities, we'll even go back to more fundamental, understand the dynamics of your own family. Just think about the dynamics of your own family, and they are extremely dynamic. And then when you join families into neighbourhoods, work out the dynamics of a neighbourhood, and then try and wrap it around a community and say, well, what is it? What is it we're trying to do, and what parts can we contribute to and continue to do so? And then put over a traumatic event. A traumatic event in the sense that it's something that personally challenges you. You probably haven't got an experience, you haven't got a picture of what's about to happen, you haven't got any reference point. And then I think we've got something to build with. I look around this room and there's lots of faces we know, lots of faces that have been there, lots of faces that were either there the day after, and if I use the 7th of February as the footprint, many faces that took different roles on. How many people in this room would have thought that they become community leaders on the 8th of February, the 9th of February, the 10th of February, the 10th of March, the 10th of April, 2 years on, 3 years on? And I think Daryl was spot on when it's different and we can't go back. So we've got to actually understand that we're not going back. One of the things I watched in the early stage, and I'm not sure this is a smart political statement, but those things we will rebuild were a set of words that were put out really early after the 7th of February, and in some cases I think they were the wrong words. And people will challenge that. They might have been strong in leadership, they might have been strong about rebuilding something we actually loved and wanted to rebuild, but for us to rebuild, those words actually were almost saying we're going to go back to the way it was on the 6th of February. And there's some things that were taken away from us. Lots of things that were taken away from us that we can't replace, never will. So all of those things I think underpin it to say, what is it? If you want to actually have the gender discussion, which I actually don't, because I actually think it's interesting about acknowledging and understand that we are different in the way in which we operate. And you can have that, but I don't know where it takes you. And that's probably why I don't want to have it, because I'm not sure it's the road you want to travel all the time. But on the same token, acknowledge we are different and we offer things different. Acknowledge the fact that the male, and we've done some work in the fire services about what happens on that afternoon of the fire, and the next fire will be the same. What does the male want to do? A community member and a male will want to do stuff. He'll get all pumped up and he'll be out there and he'll be doing things. Who's in the family unit, who's going to do the thinking? There's good research that a female brain will start to think about me, the family unit, and what's going to happen down the track. Where the male has probably got the 5-minute window, the 10-minute window, the do window, and continue to do. And sometimes leads them into trouble. And when they lead to the fact that it's out of their control mechanism, it's a whole set of other issues that then we deal with for a long term. And the other one about it that I learnt the most about out of the 7th of February was the behaviour of communities, and all those things come back. So traumatised community, next minute it's a stressed community, it's a frustrated community. It goes back and creates violence and frustration at family units. We saw it all happen. We watched it happen in front of us. And do you reckon you can turn it around overnight? You can't. You know, I was sitting in a position, as Daryl well knows, that was one of the suits, I suppose, that walked in and tried to work out how do we actually give these communities support. And you know what? The system that we thought was the recovery system wasn't going to work for us. And we had to start to change things. And there's people in this room that were part of that change. And then there was others that said, you can't change it on the run. But the agility, attitudes and approach were the critical things. And some of those, the A words, still travel with all of us now. How do you actually be agile enough to actually give some solid commitment, understanding, acknowledge local? I reckon local is the absolute answer to many things, but it can't do it by itself all the time. So it has to be supplemented somewhere. How do you get the balance? We won't get that right. But if we're aware of it, we'll probably start to get the balance of the seesaw working better. When you go to firefighters, I think we've got inherent problems, and I think I didn't hear Bob talk in totality, but Bob, when I walked in, was talking about the generics of a fire service that does response stuff and doesn't do the prevention stuff and the preparedness. I'd hope to think we're a bit better than that we actually do spend time on the prevention and the preparedness and the programs that matter. Have we got them right? Probably not. Have we got programs that are dealing with the 80%? Probably. In some instances they work and others they don't. Depends. You can actually have that debate about how close we are to the mark, and it's a worthwhile debate. But what I think we've still got in the fire service, you go back to the fire service question, it's still a male-dominated place. We have to change it. That has to change. And that's not a 5-minute job. That's not Ewan's job as Chief of CFA, it's across the globe. They are male organisations. I've watched the behaviour of brigades. I've walked into fire brigades unannounced, and a couple of brigades that are very, very close to this discussion, and opened the door and walked in and thought, if I was a female, would I want to stay here? What did I see? What was the discussion? Was it welcoming to allow me to stay? Ask that question. So, yeah, the behaviour, the language people use, the way in which they open their arms and say, come on, let's be part of it, it's pretty simple stuff, but it's actually culture. And some of those cultures have to change. And I think there's a fair way. On the same token, does that have to be 50-50? I'm a member of Fire Brigade at Bayswater, a volunteer member that's dominated by females. Female captain, the brigade management team has got more females than males. And you know what? You know why there's more females in there? Because when you open the door, you see females. So the females stay, because they're welcomed. And it took a while to do that. But it was a conscious effort to do it. It just didn't happen. It was a conscious effort to make it happen. And you know what? After the aftermath of when the events get traumatic, it's a different discussion. So it doesn't just happen in the front end of it, it happens right through the whole brigade about the discussion they have. They see things different. There is a different discussion. And in closing, and it's got nothing to do with this event, it's actually got to do with management and discussion about males and females. I was 25 years at CFA in a male-dominated organisation. One female director, no regional managers that were females in an organisation for a long period of time. I went to DHS. I was the only male in the management group. 9 directors and executive director, and I was one of them. And you reckon the discussion wasn't different? You know how quick I learnt that? On the Tuesday morning after I started it. It was a discussion, I went, this is fantastic. I was walking out with a grin on my face saying, what a different discussion. Like a totally different discussion. I learned a couple of things about the girls. They taught me a few new tricks. So it was all good there. But from a male-dominated organisation to a female-dominated management team in DHS, what a dynamic in a week and a half. Absolutely amazing. But what's that mean? So where's it go with Bob's discussion? I don't know. We'd have to probably work that through a lot more. No, certainly.
I think you're probably at a bit of a disadvantage, Craig, because you missed out on today. And today all morning was pretty much saying what the negatives are to that current construction of masculinity. And in regard to women, look at who are the managers, look at the lineup here. Yeah, so there are some other reasons to try and address masculinity.
Yeah. So when we talk, that's why I talk about, when we talk about gender, and you look at one side of it talking about, I think we've got to get the balanced discussion and have the balanced discussion, and that'll be good for all of us. That's something that's really important. But on the same token, I look at post-traumatic issues. Some of the best communities were driven by female intervention, and the leaders become females. Don't know the solution to that, don't know the recipe, but you know what? Some of the best community outcomes were driven by the fact females took leadership positions they traditionally hadn't. Now, ask yourself the question about that, and I don't know whether we've got the answer or a recipe about that either, but it's interesting that that's where the communities were led by. There's a person in the back of the room here, I won't say who she is, but she came to me at Kinglake West 1 with a written proposal and said, we want to do this, no one else will back us in. We went somewhere, I don't know exactly what was written on that piece of paper, but we went somewhere, and you know what? It involved government money. I never told anyone we did it. The minister asked me one day and said, what are you doing up at Kinglake? I said, oh, not a lot. And it went on for weeks, and cost me a lot of money, or the department a lot of money. It was about backing in a good idea. It was a risk. It was a calculated risk. And that one person that sits in the back of the room here today knows what I'm talking about, what it actually did. Because it was actually about connection of females, having a discussion, putting people in a safe place to have the discussion. And you know what? Some things were different. Very different, and the frustration that was coming out of the boys about violence, the frustration was coming out of the boys about how they were behaving towards others, not only females, and we felt it, and we knew that was a good thing to back in financially, but it empowered locals to make it happen. It wasn't about us. We drove out of the place. We didn't live there. We actually empowered people to go and do things, and that was about attitude and approach that these people wanted to do things. And you know what? if we didn't do that, I'd hate to think what some of the outcomes would have been, because they would have been very ordinary outcomes. And that was about trusting people and giving people an opportunity to lead in their community and show it. That's why I support Daryl so much about the local community. We've just got to get the mix right of how you support that to make it happen. So I probably went all over the shop from what your question was. Was I meant to answer the question?
Yes, but
Damn it.
I think you have been at a disadvantage about not being here. And are you able to stay for a while?
I've got it. Ewan and I have got to be somewhere else.
Okay, Ewan's next.
So Ewan's next.
And then if...
but I'll stay as long as I can, but I've...
Thank you very much before you're on your bike and on your way. Ewan, can you tell us about your ideal world and what needs to change?
Yeah, look, first of all, Bob, your presentation I found very confronting. Probably didn't agree with everything that you said, but it's probably made me a little bit angry inside that as a senior manager within this emergency services sector, I think we've been treading water in this issue. And there have been a lot of actions and solutions. I think one of the things that we can do which will have a positive impact, I can't explain why, but that is to increase the number of women across the board, leadership positions within our career ranks and also within our volunteer ranks. Within CFA, it is intolerably low, and I think you've stirred something up in me, Bob. The other thing is, on all those check boxes about masculinity and paternalism, guilty as charged on all of them. So I'm like sitting here in front of you, and I read all the briefing notes last night. And sometimes, Craig, all I need is a hug. Reading all the briefing notes, I've got to say I've never been so nervous, and I talk in front of a lot of groups. I've never felt so nervous because I sense a loss of control because I don't actually know what the answer is. However, can I just share a couple of thoughts? And the first is you talked about prevention, and again, probably a little bit like Craig, we might need to have a talk about that, but how do we build a capacity within our people so that this doesn't occur, so that women don't feel marginalised, they're not abused, we have a much more respectful relationship. And I was kind of thinking that, we place a lot on safety and safety culture, and it's number one in everything we do. When we do a briefing, we talk about safety. But that's all about physical safety. There's a lot about, medical wellness and how do you feel. But I don't think we spend nearly enough time on your emotional wellness and on your spiritual wellness. And I think there are two areas which I know when I talk to groups, often I talk about the four capacities of your physical capacity, your intellectual capacity, your emotional capacity and your spiritual capacity. And people go all sort of funny on me sometimes, and I say, well, in terms of you looking after yourself, you kind of got to consider each of those things. So I think the emotional and the spiritual are two things that we don't put enough emphasis on. I think at the core of this, for both men and women, is a sense of self-worth, a sense of self-confidence, a sense of self-purpose, and generally a sense of worth within society. And often I find that, you got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and again, I'm not a psychologist, but I think right down the bottom is a sense of security. Somewhere, Bob, help me. But I think this is really fundamental to the way in which we operate, not only as a fire service and a community organisation, but also as a society. So I think there's a real societal challenge there. Also, one of the reasons why I felt a bit inadequate, because I didn't go through Black Saturday in Victoria. I was in South Australia at the time. I've certainly experienced a number of the fallouts with CFA, but when I look back to Ash Wednesday, and there are a whole lot of things happened to me and others after Ash Wednesday. I lived through some bad times after the Linton fire, and in my time in South Australia we had a major fire in the Eyre Peninsula. and certainly on the Eyre Peninsula, Michelle Tuckey and her team, they were absolutely fantastic. So I think we need to, when we have these major events, go back to the health professionals and seek their advice, because I think each different situation invokes a different response. Mark made a reference to a visit I made to Buxton Fire Brigade, and I feel a bit conflicted here, because on one hand it's the typical masculine role, but it doesn't have to be masculine. But I think the visible leadership in affected communities is really, really important, not only within the organisations and the emergency services, but I see I'm a leader within a service, but I'm a leader in a sector, but I'm also a leader in the community as well, with others. And after these massive events, I think that there's a role to be played across the broader community for leadership. Keeping it local, and both Daryl and Craig have talked about keeping it local. I just think back to a day, about 3 or 4 days after the Eyre Peninsula fire, the Wangari fire at Eyre Peninsula, and we decided to have a barbecue at Tumby Bay. We had about 400 people at this barbecue, mainly from the Country Fire Service, but it was a barbecue where there were tears, there were hugs, there were war stories told, there were connections made, and I sense that it was a very, very powerful take-off point from which we then embedded a whole lot of peers and health professionals amongst the CFS population, and indeed amongst the farming population on the Eyre Peninsula. So we use that as a bit of a catalyst to sort of bring people in and then say there's all this help which is available. So look, that's probably all I can say. I could tell a few stories personally. Well, I would tell a story personally. I have always sought out the advice of women. The 3 closest people in my life are all women, and I think Craig has talked about the different style of communication, the different style of analysis and problem solving, that in my view women are much better at doing this than men. So in my personal journey, the one-on-one with a number of females has, I think, got me through a couple of really, really difficult situations. So for men, I think women are part of the key, part of the solution. It's that feeling of confident companionship and that confidence in communication that you can have with someone. I think men, I might be biased here, I think men can have a much closer relationship with women than they can have with other men. So I think women are actually critical to it. So I come back to where do we go from here? I think the real challenge for an organisation like CFA and many others in our sector is to set some targets about how many women we have in senior leadership, middle management, on the floor and throughout the organisation. I think unless we start taking those targets seriously and reporting against them, I think we're just treading water.
Thank you. I think you've said a lot. If you could both stay just for a little while, can you? Minister? Yes, Minister. Just to finish up, Peter, you're the last one. You're a very important one because you're from our Hume region and the Department of Environment and Primary Industries. I want everybody at the end to have time to ask questions. I think especially our 2 researchers, Bob and Deb, if you've got questions to ask the panel quickly. So Peter, can you tell us about what you think the ideal world is, and the same question as the others about gender from your perspective?
Thanks. Look, I just want to give a bit of an insight on what Debbie is and how it's a little bit different from the other organisations. That we're transparent to the media. You only ever see yellow overalls on telly. and our staff, they hate it. They're not considered part of the community, they're considered against them because they didn't put the fire out, those kinds of things. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic that our staff face, and yet most of them are volunteers, and I'm talking about here deputy people, Parks Victoria and so on, so what we call as our emergency network emergency organisation. And so that's just a bit of context. The other thing is that in terms of how we've approached critical incidents, I suppose, we didn't start from scratch on Black Saturday. We had the 2003 fires, went for 59 days, 2006-7 fires, 69 days. Extremely stressful occurrences for a lot of people over a long period of time. So we came into Black Saturday with a little bit of a plan, a little bit of knowledge about how we might manage these things, but of course we were totally overwhelmed, I guess, by what happened on that day. The other thing is that, you know, we have people involved not just only on the fire ground, and Sharon's story brought tears to my eyes, I must admit, today, because I hadn't heard it and I feel so responsible. But anyway, but there's lots of people in leadership roles, and we tend to forget about those people, and particularly, you know, reflect on the experiences of the people that I asked to do jobs on that day, their roles, and then got vilified in the Royal Commission. You know, it's just really horrible to see all that sort of stuff play out. And so I think as part of this is also really important about supporting those people in leadership roles, you know, right up to Lapo and Ewan and Alan Goodman in my organisation, because it's got to go right through the whole ranks, because if these guys fall over, the whole thing falls over as well. The other thing that I just want to briefly touch on is that earlier this year we had the Harrowville fire, and people are probably aware that tragically we lost 2 firefighters, and it's a sort of a huge impact when it's kind of your own. In some regards, Black Saturday in the sense terrible, it's a bit remote, but when it's your own people killed at a fire, it really does have a huge impact through your organisation, and I'm talking about the whole of Deputy across the state. So some of the things that we've learned from that is that we're now going to develop a crisis management plan, and David Rich is in the audience today, and he's leading that. And so we're going to formalise how we actually deal with I guess, critical incidents when they occur. The other thing that really came out of that, and I know this has been part of the dialogue today, is about counselling, and we had some very strong feedback from staff that they just wanted to be with their family and friends in the first instance. So what we did with our people, the crews that were there, we got them home back to Mitabita and back to Corrion, where they could be with their families. And I think that the crew just sat in the depot all night with their families around them at Corrion, sort of debriefing amongst themselves. And then we follow that up with counsellors as required, and obviously try and tailor that to individuals. The other one is that for the first time we did it following the 09 fires, but this time around we set up a formal risk register. So we identified those people we felt at most risk in our organisation, and we monitor them on a regular basis. And we've also employed some, I guess, psychological expertise to help us to know when we should intervene if we need to. So those are some of the things that we learnt out of the Harrowville fire, and I just wanted to share that with you. And I guess from today and the stuff that I read, that we definitely, and I don't think in our employee assistance program and our peer support programs and so on, I don't think the gender word had ever been mentioned, and so it's something that we need to build into our crisis management plan. So David, just make a note of that, please. And the other one is, and again, Ewan touched on, it's about the role of women and increasing their roles in emergency management, and I think that is really critical. We are also a very male-dominated organisation. There's too many old farts like myself in it that is sort of keeping everyone else from moving up through the ranks, but that will change, and I think you know, you're right, Ewan, we need to actually set targets because otherwise it just won't happen. So they're just a couple of things that I thought I'd just like to share with you.
Thank you. Now it's really open to the floor. I'm not going to make comment, but I thought, does Deb or Bob, would you like to come here? I don't think you've still got your mic.
Craig, I was really troubled by someone in your position and in the context of this conference saying quite openly that you didn't think the gender discussion was worth having, you didn't want to have it, you didn't see it as relevant, and then later on acknowledging that we're talking about a male-dominated organisation, you praise the role of women. So I'm curious about why it is that you don't want to talk about gender and why you don't think it's relevant to speak about in the context, given the focus of what today is about.
Well, we've been a strong supporter of this, Bob, so we wanted the discussion. I suppose one of the things that I've been worried about for a while is the discussion about gender, or is it about valuing the people we engage, and you come down a different road? So you open up, is the gate you're opening about gender, or is it the gate you're opening is about the valuing a cross-section of people forgetting gender and hope that it answers itself and have some treatments along the way to encourage, as you and say, encourage more? If we only focus on the gender issue, are we picking up the true community issue? Because we've still got this, I suppose, and I look at CFA and I look at SES in numbers, English-speaking, male-dominated organisations. So what I'm suggesting is should we have the debate about is it the gender or broad community involvement that everyone's got a role to play and you come a different road to get to the same outcome? Worthwhile discussion.
Elaine, have you got anything that you would like to say?
I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to just come back and again and thank those of you, and particularly I'm looking at the men in the room who spoke, and I'd like to recognize the men in the room who spoke about gender. Regardless of whether you want to have the discussion or not, it was a discussion about gender. It's amazing to me always how in these conversations kind of quickly gender zooms off this way, and we're, I think, perilously close to a critical mistake, assuming that if you speak about gender, you cannot understand at the same time community-based disaster risk reduction. They are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue, and the colleagues that I've been arguing with or working with in the United Nations say that we cannot have a sustainable, disaster-resilient world or planet without having fundamental social justice, without having sustainable development, and we cannot have those without gender justice as well. And that's where this critical discussion around privilege and learning from each other and learning where we can give and where we can't give and what compromises we can make and how to be moral and full and human beings in the world and create a world that we want to give to our boys and our girls and we want to grow up and die in, live and die for, really. That's a conversation we have to have together, but I'm rambling here. Just one more thought. I'd like to just second what Bob, you focused us again on this discussion of prevention, and I think that is where this has to go again. As much as we have learned, and most of our discussion today has been necessarily because of the questions that were posed and because of the events are so current, they've been about recovery, they've been about loss and impact. But the challenge to us as a people on this planet is not that. Because what we're recovering from is just a sense of, or just a path that gets us toward the next disaster. That's what's the reality that we face. One drought after another, one wildfire after another, one flood after another, right? So we have to shift our attention and figure out ways that women and men and boys and girls across the spectrum of the human universe can work together and find some common ground to identify what are the driving causes of disaster in this world. Because we created them. That's different than natural hazards, different than technological hazards, hazards not being disasters. We create disasters, right? And so we can create different ways of being women and men in the world as well, because we've created that as well and given it as a burdensome legacy to the boys of our lives. And I'm speaking here as a mother of sons. Burdensome legacy, but at the same time an opportunity for enormous action. So I call on the men, really. I'm wrapping up here if you gave me the mic. Yeah. I'm calling on the men in this room again to be there, to carry on the conversation, to invite us all back again in 5 years and show us what's changed. What's changed? Because I think that there's enormous, if I'm not wrong here, that there's a lot of emotion in the room and a lot of ideas in the room, and people, going back to my metaphor of the kaleidoscope, see a little bit different slice of a different reality. We don't have one world that we share. We all want to do slightly different things, right? But ultimately, we have to work together to make some progress. So let's reunite. Let's come back in 5 years and challenge one another to see what actually has changed in our lives, in the lives of the people we care about, in our institutions, in the structures of dominance and power that put us all at risk, and see if we can't move in more positive directions. Thank you very much for the mic. Thank you again for your contributions.
Thank you. Deb, would you like to say anything first? Just the mic.
Yeah, I would like others to ask questions too, but I think what's happened today in the room, and journey isn't really a word that I like to use, but I think we have all gone on a journey, all of us who've sat through each one of the presentations. It's kind of layer upon layer built up a real picture of the problems that, you know, living up to that masculine script, and women, what the fallout for women and children is. And I wonder if perhaps it's all going up on the web. It would be great for senior managers of organisations to dedicate a whole day to watch it and have some discussion around that.
Thank you very much. Comment here?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on what Ewan said about just investing in the emotional and spiritual and well-being of members, and that's something. Like as an organisation, we invest a lot in the safety of our members. We don't want anyone to get hurt. And that's physical and mental illness or stress and things like that. And, I had, within my own command, we've invested quite a lot to actually run some training with our health professionals for members to cope with stress, to identify the triggers for stress, so how to develop self-care plans, giving them resilience type tools to actually work with, and not only for themselves but their families. And whilst I've done it within my own command, that's the first phase. We want to take it to more advanced phases down the track, because we had incidents of post-traumatic stress creeping in from some of our members that came from other areas, and it certainly put a stop to that. But we get our members exposed to a whole range of issues that no one really wants to see, particularly when you're dealing with sex crimes, child pornography and things like that. And we're looking at more advanced levels of support for our members on how do they actually identify themselves. Where are their triggers? How can they actually recognise the need for help and support? And I think that could be rolled out more broadly across the whole organisation and any of these large organisations we've got, because there are a lot of things that take place in your life. Might not be work related, it might be personal related, but it's actually giving members the knowledge and tools on how to deal with these sort of incidents.
Thank you.